Welcome everybody to our webinar today, Mechanisms of Influence, Adventures in Media Literacy with the Mi'kmaq Bridging Year Program. So just making sure everybody knows they're in the right session. Our speaker today, first I'd like to start with an acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that we are variously located, at least virtually, in the ancestral and unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, Innu, and Inuit peoples. Our speaker today is Marc Bragdon. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Marc, he is the Information Systems Librarian at the University of New Brunswick Libraries. He's a former Systems Librarian for the Nunavut Public Library Services and currently serves as Liaison Librarian for the UNB Faculty of Education, the Mi'kmaq Wolastoqey Center, the Department of Culture and Media Studies in the Faculty of Arts, and online learning programs. His research interests include the intersection of intercultural communication theory and online learning support, as well as media literacy. So Marc is joining us today. He did a session similar to this at the APLA conference, but I know there were a lot of folks in CAUL who may not have been able to make that session, so he has graciously agreed to reprise that session for us here. Just a few housekeeping things. One, we are recording the session so that those who are unable to make the session today are able to look at it after, and also for you to go back and look at the session as many times as you want. We ask that you mute yourself when you are, unless you have to ask a question. If you want to ask a question, you can unmute. You can also there's a chat button on the left-hand side of your screen. If you can type your questions in the chat, I'll be monitoring that. That's pretty much all I had to say in terms of our of the housekeeping stuff. But please join me in welcoming Marc Bragdon, and take it away, Marc.
Thank you, Cynthia. We had a couple of test runs over a couple of weeks to get really familiar with the Skype for Business environment and making a few changes here and there to ensure that everything goes as smoothly as possible. We're going to hope to channel that magic through today. I'm at UNB Fredericton, and out my window I was going to flash a mirror to show you, but then the glare, at least I tested that and it didn't work, but I'm looking out onto the Wolastoqey, the river valley here, and it's all covered in snow as far as the eye can see. It's just a beautiful day. It's freezing in my office, which promises to keep me awake, particularly after a nice big cup of coffee. This is a reprise to a large extent of a session that I gave at APLA in the late spring, early summer about my involvement in a Bridging Year program. I'll get into what that is exactly. And at the time, and I'll repeat that, I was grateful for the opportunity to actually reflect on my work with the Bridging Year students in the program, the Mi'kmaq Wolastoqey Center, in particular because I hadn't really given it a lot of methodical thought as to what I'd been doing. A lot of the time, my own process, maybe it's not very traditional librarian-like, but I tend to kind of move with my intuition and detect patterns of how what I'm doing is being received and move with those patterns. And so this has been an opportunity for me to kind of reverse engineer what I've been doing and have a bit better sense, even moving forward, as to what I'd like to do. So I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for Cynthia's prodding to do this follow-up session for you and others. So I'm going to now bring up my presentation. See how that goes. And it looks to me like it came up fine. So it's been about 6 or 7 years that I've been working with these students. I'll get into who they are specifically, but essentially what I've been doing with a young group of students. So people ask me, what have I been doing with these students? And as I said, it was a bit of an intuitive process that wasn't essentially mapped out. So I'd often say, well, we're doing media literacy modules where we deconstruct the mechanisms of influence at play in the media that we all consume. And I like that phrase in part because it was suitably vague. It sounded kind of mysterious, but didn't really get at what exactly I was doing. But essentially it just means those rhetorical, psychological, technical tricks or techniques that are used to take an idea and place it into the minds of people, to bring an idea into the public sphere. And so we would deconstruct those mechanisms a little bit to just see how they worked and that sort of thing. And this was particularly interesting with these students because so often these mechanisms have been used against them. This work coincided with some of the things I was doing in my personal life around sound and video projects. I do some music and video production stuff that essentially is kind of deconstructing, I guess you'd say, popular culture and kind of skewering it in satirical and comedic ways. And so that at the same time, I was trying to get a handle, by virtue of being the liaison for the Mi'kmaq-Wolastoqey Center, a little bit more of a handle on First Nation issues. And because of my own preferences, I was gravitating towards comedy and satirical stuff like Thomas King and Sherman Alexie. And Chelsea Vowell's blog here, I've got a little screenshot of it, then turned me on to Ryan McMahon. She had a post a few years ago now, with this quote from Ryan McMahon, who's an Ojibwe comedian that some of you may know. And I'll just read it here. What do you do when you wake up on a daily basis and the news around you, the media, music, movies, and television you consume does not represent you and you can't connect with it? You make your own. This kind of struck me at the time as this aha moment that I had to get a handle on. So we were deconstructing these mechanisms of influence, or these rhetorical tools, and I thought at some point, when I knew how, it would be interesting to have these students start to reconstruct them, reconstitute them to their own ends and for their own purposes, kind of seize the means of production. But I didn't know how to do it at the time. So we were basically one piece of media literacy in, and that is analyzing what's going on. But eventually I was hoping to figure out a way that we could start to actually create some media of our own. And so that's where I was with that about 6 or 7 years ago. I kept it in the back of my mind and was just looking at it for an opportunity to move on it. But before I get too ahead of myself, just to say a little bit about the Mi'kmaq-Wolastoqey Center. They're housed in the Faculty of Education. It started out as the Mi'kmaq-Maliseet Institute back in the, I think it was the late 70s actually, or the early 80s by an educator named Willis Hamilton. And it has been since then a bulwark for cultural and language preservation in the region, and increasingly for resurgence. So they do original research. There's a First Nations teacher education program, various language courses in Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey. And arguably the crown jewel, it's been around since 1991, is the Bridging Year program. Now, most of the students in this program have come out of the high schools in New Brunswick. There's a few from out of province, but mostly from New Brunswick, who do not have the college preparatory courses under their belt in order to qualify for a university program. So they come to the Bridging Year program and they take a mix of the high school upgrades that are college grade, if you will, in mathematics and science, as well as English. And I bolded English here because that's where I come in. And they take a couple of university courses as well, but this is the core of what they're taking. So in the English, they take 2 units, 1 per semester, the first being the fundamentals of clear and effective writing, and the second in oral communication, which also has a presentation component, public speaking component to it. Kind of scares some people. I just want to do a shout out to Gail Tucker, who has been the English teacher for about 15 years, and Gail was looking for somebody who could address some of the issues around the quality of the research that was going into an English paper. So she reached out to me, and I jumped on board with her, and it turned out to be one of the most fortuitous meetings of my life with Gail. She's somebody who is constantly revising her teaching methods, her pedagogy, constantly questioning what she's doing, and that mixed well with my own approach to information literacy. I get pretty bored with doing the same sort of rundown type sessions, so I'm always trying to make it at least interesting to me, with the assumption that if I'm interested, other people risk being interested too. And she was really my entry point into the Mi'kmaq-Wolastoqey Center, and a sounding board as well as a wealth of information, very upfront about her own experiences teaching First Nations students, and in her own words, coming to terms with her own whiteness, that settler colonial kind of isness that we have around having certain expectations of a situation that the situation doesn't necessarily bear out. And so, I'm very happy to have worked with her for this long. She really is the embodiment of what it means to be a bridge between cultures, always trying to evolve and very much presenting her own biases up front to students to talk about what her experiences are, and that very much guided my own approaches as well. Oh, this is just a part of a syllabus there where I've highlighted the piece that I was brought into around literature reviews, submitting a list of sources you have explored and or will be using for research, recognizing the reality that the students are not going to be going to the library databases. If they do, it's just going to be to humor you in a cursory way because you've asked them to, but mostly they're going to be getting their information off of the internet. And so the question was, what could I do to optimize their use of that literature and get them thinking critically about the information that they're encountering on a regular basis and the information that they would then actively seek out on a particular subject. So I would come into the class and I would do battle with Google for the hearts and minds of these students. And just to say a couple of things about that, and kind of ties into the webinar as well, it could feel kind of ridiculous getting in front of a number of First Nations students as unquestionably an authority figure, telling them how they should question authority, and basically presenting my own method coming out of my own background, which may not overlap a heck of a lot with their own. And then secondly to that, it can feel a little ridiculous coming to a webinar like this and talking about the quote-unquote great things that I've done in this regard. But ultimately, when I reflect on what I've done, it's not about anything that I've done that's been great, it's about the great things that I've learned in working with Mi'kmaq-Wolastoqey Center and working with these students. And one thing that really came out of this work, and that Gail impressed upon me, that I've seen in various interactions within the center, is that these students bring their whole lives to the classroom. There's no real division between their personal and academic lives. Everything is right there. And I've certainly noticed it. Like many of you, I go into classrooms on a regular basis across the university or wherever you may be, and I'm often greeted with a lot of apathy and essentially kind of a very palpable division between myself and the students that I'm encountering. When I walk into one of these bridging year classes, the sense of presence in the room, the energy, whether positive or negative, is very much there. And I was encouraged to bring my whole self in turn to these classes. And if I did so, if I tied the sort of things I was talking about to my own life, and if I explained that I have a certain perspective on matters that comes from having a certain background, and invited them to share their own, then a certain level of trust was established. So, in that spirit, I'm going to share a little bit of who I am with you, bring my whole self to this webinar so you have an immersion into the approach that I took with these students, and hopefully it helps hammer home some of the points that I'd like to make. So here I am back in 1973, just having moved to Fredericton from Woodstock, New Brunswick, living in residences at the top of the hill. This was right in the middle of the Vietnam War, I guess, at the time. And I was a bit of a problem child, you could say. My main problem being authority. And I grew up with a single mother who, instead of engaging in a futile battle of wits with me, or will with me, would engage in a battle of wits and employ a number of different Jedi mind tricks and that sort of Tom Sawyer approach where, if you remember the Mark Twain novel where Tom would get his friends to pay him for the privilege of whitewashing a fence and those sorts of things, my mother knew how to make me do things that a kid might not want to do, like get up for school and make it to the bus on time by making it fun and turning games into things. And one of the things that I really took away from my upbringing in that regard is that if you control the frame of an engagement, of an encounter, in other words, if you are able to set the context for the dynamic in which a number of people are operating, much like, let's say, the director of a movie sets the stage, then you have tremendous influence over the actions that take place within it. And that's always stuck with me. Just to give you a living example from my own life, and this is going to shock some of you, might even scandalize a few, but I'm going to say it anyways. I'm an avid cyclist, and I don't wear a helmet. I've tried it, but I don't like it. And we have in Fredericton, perhaps you have these sorts of patrols in your own cities as well, a trail patrol that, if you're not wearing a helmet, will stop you and fine you $25. And these are invariably students from either our St. Thomas or UNB campuses here in Fredericton who are getting a little bit of experience as to what it might be like. They're typically in criminology, and they want to know, hey, is law enforcement something that I really want to do moving forward? So anyways, they stop me, and I say, you know, I used to be the criminology librarian at St. Thomas, which is true. And I've looked into this research, and I even presented in my classes around this, that if you actually take a look at the statistics, most cycling accidents that are fatal or otherwise debilitating have to do with rotational forces, which is to say neck trauma. Well, a helmet's not going to help you with that. If you look at toxicology reports for the higher number of mortalities of people not wearing helmets versus those wearing helmets, well, many of them were drunk or high. Well, I'm not drunk or high. And there's a growing body of research that suggests that wearing a helmet encourages people to take risks. So while you're telling me the law is the law, my number one concern is my own safety. And so if you want to give me a fine, then go ahead. And that law has been in place for 20 years now, and I've never had a fine. Never mind that I've cherry-picked the data and presented it to it, but I've ultimately controlled the frame there, if you get my drift. So that's sort of the approach that I take to understanding what it means to control context. So if we take this, and this all ties into media literacy, which I'll make the point here. If we take this into the classroom, and we would always talk about current events, and many of the essay topics that Gail would hand out had to do with contemporary at the time events or topics that had some bearing on First Nations. And so in the second year in, we were in the middle of the shale gas protests in Rexton, Nelsabuktuk, and we were taking a look at some of the media around that. And this is a quote from Here magazine, which used to be an entertainment weekly out of New Brunswick. And here the editor of that paper was tying the legitimacy of protests to legality. And essentially, if it's illegal, then it's wrong. And this reflected very much the rhetoric that you would hear in sources like the Globe and Mail, and even to some extent the CBC, the Huffington Post, and what have you. And this is the sort of message that was pretty common at the time. And so what do you do with that when you don't have the analytical tools yourself or the vocabulary to counterpunch effectively? So what we would do is take a look at instances where the counterpunch was effective. So we would read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, where he's essentially facing the same issue around illegal protests, but then spin it as civil disobedience. And instead of presenting the law is the law type of argument, he would be tying the legitimacy of law to the standard of justice. And so this is the sort of thing we would do, take a look at these cases and ask what it really means to have respect for the law. And so in that case, we were essentially questioning a frame's fundamental assumptions. And then we might look at some other sources, this one from the UK Guardian about the same events, and examine how shifts in perspective ever so slight can profoundly affect the frame that you're in. It's interesting that a source like the Guardian, which is the, you might argue it's the Globe and Mail of the United Kingdom to some extent, or serves a similar function as a national newspaper, is taking a very different perspective on events taking place in Canada. And that often is something, it's a fairly common occurrence in newspapers, that they're very much open and penetrating when it comes to taking a look at what's happening in other countries, if not necessarily always the case in their own. But then the Guardian has a very different editorial history than, let's say, a newspaper like the Globe and Mail, and so we talk about those sorts of things as well. And we'd start to ask how these frames come about. What is the story behind the story that gets these pieces of information with the slant that they have into the public consciousness? What I would not do with these students is run them through one of these tranquilizers. Unless, of course, the topic was insomnia. If you are having trouble sleeping, well, you could ask yourself some of these questions. Not to denigrate these, but this wasn't the sort of thing that I wanted to start with. I wanted to eschew this sort of approach of going through this diagnostic, de-emphasize it for the sake of telling a story. Get into storytelling. And this is something Gail really impressed upon me. If you want to make a point with these students, you have to frame it in terms of a story that is relatable both to yourself and to their perspective. And I can tell you from working with our elder in residence, Imelda Purley here, as I work with her in various regards. One is on the UNDTRC working group. And let's say, for example, we're talking about how we might mitigate institutional fears around affecting a certain change. Well, Imelda would go off on a story about a bear hunt. And it would be meandering, very detailed, and I'd be sitting there thinking, what does this have to do with anything? Why are we going through this? And then at some point in the story, it would have snuck right around and be tapping you on the shoulder and tie everything together, and you'd realize that we were actually dealing with this issue the whole time. And by not just taking a linear approach, but having more of a kind of a freely associative approach, a storytelling approach to thinking about issues, she was very effective in hammering different points home. Just kind of placing you in the action where you're free to play with ideas at hand. So instead of going through something like this with the students, I would put a question to them. You have a piece of information in front of you. Who benefits? Who is this benefiting? Who are the people putting out this information? What can we learn about their own stories? And so in that way, we start to engage in critical and imaginative exercises. So thinking back to the Brunswick News piece about illegal protests doing nothing but harming the cause of the protesters. Well, where does Here magazine come from? Well, it's published by Brunswick News. Well, who's Brunswick News? Well, Brunswick News is owned by the Irvings in New Brunswick. And so who are they? And so getting deeper and deeper into digging up where exactly information is coming from, and again, who benefits? What is the story behind that? So moving ahead a couple of years from there into the world of pipelines, maybe it's just a function of who I am, but I tend to try and be, as much as I can, perspective agnostic on matters. I really want to try and dig at what the truth of a particular issue might be, not just from one standpoint. Maybe it's a fool's game in the end because maybe there is no truth, but still it's nice to try and at least triangulate between various perspectives to get at some sort of solid ground. But I personally find the whole morass of pipeline controversy, well, it hurts my head. You have one side that, of course, is telling you you're selling out the future with these pipelines and the future is now. You have the other side talking about how the anti-pipeline movement does not appreciate global economic realities, and we're cutting ourselves off at the knees when we whole hog cancel these sorts of projects. And we have at the moment a revival of talk around pipelines here in New Brunswick with a change of governments. So sending students to the academic sources, I don't find that that's necessarily very useful. They don't magically clear things up, and they're often overly specific and dense, and just not the entry point. So instead, in looking at these various sources, we ask ourselves, who benefits? Who is the Sierra Club? Well, where does the Fraser Institute come from? What exactly are the angles that they're operating from? So we'll actually do some Google searching around the organizations that are putting out this information to get a sense of who they are. You know, put in Fraser Institute, maybe look at the Wikipedia page. I encourage people to throw in controversy in their keywords to see if anything comes up. And you can certainly find as many about the Sierra Club as you can about the Fraser Institute. That's for sure. Okay, so I'd mentioned that I've been working on some media projects personally, and it started to bleed into my professional life. And at the same time, the Bridging Year program was starting to offer some courses online so that people could, I don't know if you're familiar with these rural university, rural U type initiatives that are happening in various places. I know they're happening in Maine where my wife works, where college, or high school kids rather, can take some college credits to get a sense of what it would be like to get into university. And UNB is doing some of the same sorts of things. So no, since they weren't coming onto campus, I wasn't going to meet these students, but Gail was engaging with them in the desire to learn environment. I started to make some video that could be pumped out to these courses, and I was also playing around with the flipped classroom model. And so I came up with this idea of the contextualizer video, and it's basically a video where I'm going to show you a snippet from it, but it starts with me reading the Globe and Mail and looking at a full-page advertising supplement around the forestry industry, and a big forestry industry giant refuting a lot of the Sierra Club claims, in particular to their less than munificent practices, if you will. And so we basically talk about the stories behind the stories that we tell about facts based on where we're coming from. And it was a bit of a bait and switch ultimately, because I would eventually slip that diagnostic where you're asking about who the author is, when was it published, how do they back up their claims, and all those sorts of things, but not before I was able to establish a bit of a story around why that would be a useful practice.
Now, if I try not to indulge my inclination to side with the tree huggers in this case, who am I supposed to believe? If we're talking facts, why can't we agree on at least these?
Why can't we just get along?
It's actually pretty simple. We literally inhabit different worlds, represented by wildly divergent contexts. It's a fact that this tree is wood. It's also a fact that this T-ball bat is wood. Now, if you have a passion for ball bats, you might interpret, prioritize, and combine facts about trees in a different way than an eco-warrior might. Are you right? Within your baseball batty context? Sure.
Why is it wrapped in electrical tape?
For other contexts, should they arise. But you see, critical thinking is less about reinforcing your own context and opinions than it is an exploration of them, their composition, their defenses, agendas, where they overlap with or bump up sometimes violently against each other. We seek to understand what ours and other contexts are made of, and how they create meaning. And so if your ultimate context is a concern for the truth, whatever that means to you, then there's some work ahead. But not to worry, we have a plan. It's much different than the old plan. Introducing the Contextualizer. My simple, unpatented, free-to-use tool for figuring out what is going on in any situation. When you approach a new subject, which is to say any subject you know little to nothing about, you aren't likely to be equipped to know what's true about it. You can equip yourself, however, to think critically about what you are reading by establishing context. And how do you do that? You determine such facts as who the author is, who the publisher is, how the arguments or facts presented are supported, or what kind of proof is available, and when was the information published. This is a diagnostic tool for critically evaluating information sources. In other words, a means for you to diagnose the validity or credibility of a source. Before the tool can work, however, it needs to be calibrated, which means you need to know something about your own context before starting.
Essentially what we were getting at here ultimately was getting the students to start to consider what it means to have a context of one's own and where does that come from. Often it's very difficult, as you know, to find middle ground between, in this case, an industrialist or a forester and an eco-warrior. But if you have a better sense that your own context comes about because of a particular assemblage of experiences that you've had, then you can potentially have a sense that you're no different than anybody else, and other people's perspectives came about in the very same way. It's just that their context is very different. So we'd start to kind of take a look at what this means when you're starting to look at various issues and the literature around that. But digging at, well, what really is the context here, and where does that come from? How are they trying to set a frame, and how are they beholden to their own frame, sometimes unbeknownst to them? So I'll just skip through this one. This is another snippet from a video that we'd done. One of the exercises that these students would engage in their English class would have to do with going to various places on campus, for example, or going downtown and having let's say, walking into the student union cafeteria or going down to the bus stop in the Central Mall in the downtown core, and just having a seat and feeling in your body how the environment affected you, and then writing about that. So essentially getting to a place of embodiment where you were writing about what it is exactly that you would feel when you were in particular environments, and what do you think of that? How can you express that through your writing? And so we did a little piece on media literacy here, and part of what I was trying to get at was, once you're able to detect a frame, how can you, much like the director of a movie, actually think about what you would do differently in that frame to turn it to your advantage or to make it more comfortable. So I'm going to play this little snippet, and then I'll remember to unmute myself afterwards. So this was an assignment. This is just a little piece of a video from it, and I purposely chose a number of Korean commercials because, well, I was being naughty. I wasn't getting copyright for this, and I figured that they wouldn't necessarily come after me. So that's why this has this Korean angle to it. And they were pretty funny too, and I tried to keep it pretty light.
Assignment number 1, Operation Don't Look Away. Pick some environment you inhabit or pass through every day and zero in on one predominant advertising platform within it. It could be the banners in Facebook or the commercials that kick off many of the YouTube videos that you would be looking at on a daily basis. And instead of just moving on from them, stop right there. Take it in. click on that bait. Inhabit the narrative that it's selling you. Feel yourself jumping into the video, the billboard, the banner ad, and listen to your inner critic. Ask yourself, how does this marketing make you feel? Do I belong here? Am I the intended audience? And if not, who is? And if I am, why? If not, then why am I seeing it? Who does it really represent? Is there a common worldview, a common reality shared across the examples that you pick out? What are the most attractive aspects of what you see? What are the least attractive? And finally, what would you change in the scenes you're looking at if you were in charge? If you were the director, and why?
Okay, so we were taking a look at how getting them to start thinking creatively about the media they were consuming and how it could be tweaked. And that harkens back to Ryan McMahon's quote a little bit earlier about when you're seeing all this, you're being inundated by all this media and does not connect with you, well, what could be done to make it connect? And right around this time, fortuitously, I met a new friend and colleague who's now a professor assistant professor in the Faculty of Education here, Casey Burkholder, who presented 3 years ago at our Peace and Friendship Treaties conference in October, anyways, 3 years ago or so. And she was finishing up her dissertation at the time, and what she was working in was self-filming. It's basically participatory cinema around social justice issues and working with various populations. In her case, she was working with minorities in Hong Kong initially, and then started working with First Nations groups in and around the Montreal area, and having them tell their stories using their cell phones and using in-phone applications for doing the editing. Basically a very low barrier to starting to communicate with this media, but a little bit more intentionally and with a little bit more savvy, if ever so slightly, than just simply recording a video. Thinking a little bit more critically about what they want to say, what kind of message they want to craft, and then doing a little editing and those sorts of things. And this was another light going off for me. I thought, well, of course, this is where we need to go as a next step, is that it flows exactly from what we've been doing. And so with her, we started to develop workshops for the bridging year students around self-filming as sort of an end piece to the media literacy component. This was at a time, too, as I mentioned, I was part of the TRC and still am a part of the TRC working group here on campus. And I don't know about, some of you have probably the same initiatives happening on your own campuses. I know ours is maybe a typical example of a well-intended institutional effort that is struggling with the essential conundrum of how do you decolonize, because that's the term we use, how do you decolonize through colonial means? In other words, how do you relinquish control of the way it's always worked in order to motivate and foster genuine change? So for example, when it comes to re-engineering curricula, when there's demands for accreditation and there's a lot of trepidation around making changes and not feeling necessarily having the authority to do so or feeling competent in making those changes, these are issues that everybody's struggling with, and there's not necessarily a clear way forward. But it seemed to me that the self-filming with these students might fit into some of the TRC working group's action items. We have a 10-point action plan here, and some of the things that we're looking at, and I've just highlighted a few of them here, have to do with creating welcoming physical spaces on campus. There's point 3 here, and then just directing your attention to the 10th point here around our Mi'kmaq Holistic Way Center. They've very much been a support for the bridging year program here on campus, but they're physically located in an outlier building, you could argue, and not necessarily more visible. And so what could be done to increase their visibility? And I was thinking that the self-filming might be a great place to go with that. It could do two things essentially for the students and for the campus. First of all, we could be starting to create media projects using some of the techniques imparted by myself in terms of setting frames and making changes, as well as Gail's embodiment writing exercises. And there'd be a fairly gentle learning curve in that you're using an in-phone application to do some basic editing of some of the shots that you're doing. Secondly, though, we could take what the students create with their permission to our own administrators and our own colleagues to give them a sense of how our efforts could be guided and how they're being received already. And my hope was, secretly at the time, that this could be kind of a low-stakes proof of concept for how we could start to untangle this or deal with this conundrum of decolonization and actually participatory change. So how did we do that? What we had the students do is come into our own Harriet Irving Library and shoot some films about the cultural imprints of the spaces that they were using on a regular basis, or in many cases had never visited before. So I created this little video, and I'll play you a little snippet from it that sets the stage for bringing the students in, and I'll apologize for the sound quality. I wasn't using a mic apart from the phone, and I think there was a lawnmower happening not too far away, but let's try this anyways.
Hello everybody. We're in front of the Harriet Irving Library at a place called Poets Corner, which is a bit of a little amphitheater and meeting place. Sometimes during nice weather in the fall, you'll see the odd professor bringing their classes out here to discuss matters of academic import. The reason that we're here today is to do a little tour of the library and talk about some of the things that we've been doing over the last couple of decades or so to make the library as a place more inviting to students. And now, as UNB and the library, in this case, embarks on an indigenization initiative, which is intended to make our spaces more welcoming and also more aware of the territory upon which we are standing at the moment, we are going to be seeking your input on what we can do to better serve you. Step right this way.
Okay, so that was the challenge to students. Apart from that, I started to get into some of the things around manipulating your own shots, having a better understanding of some shooting techniques. So a few of them are listed here, and we'd even get into how you craft a narrative with shot choices. There's a lot of things that we absorb just naturally because most of us have been exposed to copious amounts of television and movies and YouTube drama and all that sort of thing. But I would get them to think a little bit more deliberately about how you actually craft a narrative using different shot choices with your phone and challenge them to work with that. I was, well, at the APLA session I did show a video, but I didn't feel like I should show one here where I don't have permission to do this in a recorded way. But I can tell you that I did show the videos that the students had created to our own library management group and some people even beyond that, and it was interesting some of the comments that the students would make in it. Some of the ones that stick with me have to do with panning around our information commons and looking at some of the artwork we have, and not saying that it doesn't speak to First Nation students, but saying that it doesn't speak to anybody, that it has no discernible cultural imprint. Like, what is this stuff? So some bewilderment around it. And then some more thoughtful, constructive feedback about how, if we're going to be putting artwork in, how could we tie in First Nation motifs to university experiences. So I remember one young man talking about how having images of a person's first hunt would be parallel as a coming of age depiction to actually attending university for the first time. So there was a lot of interesting things that came out of that. And for us, what it meant after I had shown that to our group and we had our management group and we had more discussions around it, we took a space in the library called the reading room and worked with Maui art out of our College of Craft and Design here in Fredericton. Their Aboriginal Visual Arts program has an incorporated arm that represents Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey artists, predominantly in New Brunswick, but also in the rest of the region. And we consulted with them and had them basically tell us how to repurpose the space. They came and took a look at some of these videos as well, and this is Charlie Gaffney, who's managing the project, and the painting you see behind him was done by Emma Hassensall-Purley, who's in the picture as well. And it was a heck of an experience to just let them go in and decide how the space is going to look, and kind of handing over the reins for that and establishing a level of trust both ways that continues now with some other initiatives we're doing around the room. But essentially we have a space that will enable the Mi'kmaq Wolastoqey Center to have events centrally on campus, to have TRC related events, art exhibits, and all sorts of things, and also serve as an educational piece for the rest of campus that's in a highly visual place and moves us closer to what is the Wolastoqey word here, Bilowi Dahasawasawagan, which is about allowing your thinking to change so that action will follow in a good way toward truth. So since this has started, I continue to work with the Bridging Year students in the English class on similar projects, and we've moved it to the public speaking piece as well, so I'm in there too. And I've actually started to teach self-filming in the language courses. You're supposed to use the language and create a presentation around it, so I've been going in and doing that too. And the whole experience along the way has been tremendous for me. I'm using the lessons that I've learned from this experience and all the teaching and engagement that I have, particularly the importance of telling stories and bringing your whole life to your work on a regular basis so that the meaning that it gives you can rub off on others too. And so I'm very thankful for having this opportunity to work with the students, and I hope to continue to have them influence my own thinking around what resurgence means according to their own notions. And I'm also thankful for you taking the time to go through this with me. And this would be the end. We still have a few minutes left if anybody would like to ask questions. And I'll go back to video here.
And to ask questions, you can unmute, or you can also type them into the chat box.
Yeah, for sure. Changing the way you see and think about things, it's a lot easier said than done. As we see everything, there's a part in the contextualizer video that I created where I put out this, I think it's a Hindu aphorism, like a fish is to water and a bird is to the sky, so is humanity to itself. It's very difficult to recognize the environment in which you're swimming and flying and trudging along all the time, and being able to get some perspective on it and understanding that other people are very much enmeshed in their own realities. Well, I always think that that's the key to having a bit more of a higher perspective on your own reality and how that's constructed. And that is really the challenge of this work, because there's so much misunderstanding between cultures generally, but there's I don't need to say what kind of misunderstanding has been a common strain in the Canadian and North American colonial and First Nations experience. But it's really starting to understand oneself first, I think, before you can even start to grapple with what's going on with others.
And just for everybody to know, I'll be posting not just the recording and Marc's slides, but also I'll put a link to his full video, the contextualizer video, so that you'll be able to see the full video, because we were only able to see bits and snapshots of it. Well, thank you, Marc. This has been fantastic. It's always nice to get different perspectives on how we can work in the classrooms with our students, and particularly with our Indigenous students, and ways we can approach with that idea of doing something a little different, but then also with that understanding that there is different cultural backgrounds that we have different cultural contexts. So thank you very much, and I appreciate, and I'm sure everybody else does, your willingness to share that with your experiences with us.
Well, thank you for your time, everyone.